You don't get to do that. Nate, you can't avoid this. You can't stay silent. Nate, you can't allow your fear of saying the wrong thing or saying it in the wrong way to justify you just staying quiet. Nate, we need you to speak up. We need you to be willing to use the platform that you've been given to speak about issues related to justice, race, social and racial justice, and how the gospel informs and transforms them. Nate, if we're going to see real, meaningful, lasting change when it comes to systemic issues facing our country, leaders like you need to be willing to accept the risk and unapologetically teach about God's heart for justice and how it relates to our historic and current experience in America, as well as the church's complicity in it. Those are all things that have been said to me from close friends that are pastors, professors, ministry leaders who all happen to be African American. And that has informed me, it has influenced me, it has inspired me. See, here's the truth. Here's behind the curtains. When I left on January 17 to go on sabbatical, we were supposed to be launching a Galatians, study through the book of Galatians today, May 16, on the freedom in Christ, on what the Christian faith offers us when it comes to the freedom that we experience in him. But then you let me go on sabbatical. So it's your fault. Because while I'm on sabbatical, and I've been having these conversations for a couple of years, and I start wrestling with, and I start thinking about it, I start contemplating on the significance of these issues for our church in our community at this time, the Spirit of God deeply convicted me that it was time for us to not just add this on to different things that I say or do from up here, but to settle in for a few weeks and really grapple with this issue in a way that I think we need to be willing to. Because here's what I'm going to suggest for the next 3 weeks. We are looking at, watching, and seeing firsthand a cultural standoff with a group that is on one side of the conversation and a group that is on the polar opposite side of the conversation. And because we don't understand the gospel's implications on these issues, we find ourselves gravitating towards one of those two sides. And I'll define the sides and I'll define why they're there in a little bit. But we find ourselves gravitating toward one direction or the other on this because we don't understand the issues as they are. And more importantly, we don't understand the fact that the gospel doesn't allow us to do that. You've heard me say many times that Jesus followers commit themselves to being third-way people, meaning that we are unwilling to look at the diametrically opposed sides in our culture and say, sure, I'll take that side or I'll take that side. But we look at it and say, no, both sides are not gospel-centric, not gospel-driven. What is the third way? What is the gospel-driven, gospel-reflective way? What is that? And we're willing to fight for it, and we're willing to wrestle with the tension that creates because it's just so much easier to gravitate in one direction or the other. The problem is they're culturally defined positions. They're not gospel-defined positions. They're not Christian-defined positions. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions today, next week, the following week, and going forward. Here's the 2 questions. If you're going to walk with me, and I'm inviting you to come with me, and I know we're already dealing with eggshells. I thought about throwing a whole bunch of plastic eggs up here and walking on eggshells and putting that in front of you again. First time I ever talked about money up here, that's what I did. We all feel it, right? We all feel the tension. But if I'm going to invite you to walk with me towards thinking about how the gospel itself deals with these issues and helps us to navigate them, then I'm going to ask you 2 questions. What do you need to let go of? What political position? What comfort zone? What ideology? What presupposition? What self-protective posture? What do you need to let go of to move towards this third way conversation? And secondly, what do you need to embrace? What do you need to reconsider? What do you need to be open and responsive to? What do you need to let go of? What do you need to embrace? Those are the two questions I'm going to ask you. What do you need to let go of? What do you need to embrace if you're going to walk with us down this path that I'm inviting you to walk with me on? I want to give you 3 qualifiers. Ready? There's 3 qualifiers. I'm just going to kind of throw them out there just so you understand where I'm coming from. Here's the first one. This series is not intended to be political. Nothing that I say is intended to be politically motivated or politically loaded. This conversation is far too important to be reduced to political talking points. And as much as there are political implications, politics has very little to offer us in this conversation if we're going to do it right. So I'm not coming at this from a political lens. I promise you that. Here's the problem. Many of you have politics that you hold on to, and you allow your politics to trump your faith. Your politics define your ideology and your passions and your beliefs more than your faith does. And I'm inviting you to just let me challenge that. Because if you're coming at this conversation from a political vantage point, I'm going to frustrate you, disappoint you, and anger you. I'm going to do it anyway, but I'm going to do it even more so if you're coming at this first and foremost politically. Second statement, for a second qualifier. In this series of messages, I will not say everything you think that I should say. I will not say everything that I think that I should say. I'm certainly going to say things that you don't think that I should say. And I'm not going to say everything that I want to say the way that I want to say it. So in other words, I'm going to disappoint you. So I need grace to win the day. I need grace to win the day. Third one. This series will not answer every question, solve every problem, resolve every tension, satisfy every concern, nor meet every expectation. It will come up short. I will let you down. However, I will proceed with confidence because I believe that the Word of God doesn't return void. But here's what's going on. We are stepping into a cultural divide, a cultural standoff, and this is how we're doing it. Ready? Watch this. Imagine a parent coming upstairs to 2 kids, let's say they're 10 and 12 years old, and they're having a physical altercation over a remote control. And you come upstairs as a parent and you say, what's going on? And Jimmy says, I had the remote first and Johnny tried to take it for me. And Johnny says, he's had the remote for 3 hours. I want the remote now. And what does the parent do? Here's what we're doing. We walk upstairs and we say, who had the remote first? Jimmy did? Johnny? You need to let go of the remote. It's Jimmy's remote. Johnny, you need to go to your room. And we're stepping into that argument and taking a side as though the issue is the remote. Do you know what the issue is? That they're having a physical altercation over a remote control, which means it's not my job as the parent to take a side. It's my job as a parent to correct the problem. Here's the other thing that we're doing. We have a couple that are friends of ours, and both of them had an affair on each other, and both of them have violated the marriage and caused a lot of damage to each other. But here's what we're doing. We're stepping in and saying, but she wasn't as at fault as he was, because if he was a better husband, then she wouldn't have had the affair, and maybe he was actually not as at fault because she wasn't responsive to him, so therefore she's not as at fault as he is. And we're taking sides on that as though somehow that's our job. That's what we're doing. That's how Christians are approaching this standoff. And I'm telling you, it's not okay. I'm telling you, we're getting it wrong. We got work to do. We got work to do. So let's start here. Partly because I want to encourage you in a direction, and partly because some of you are already asking the question, where am I coming from? So let me tell you where I'm coming from. Up on the screen are 9 books. These 9 books, I would tell you, I highly recommend to you. These 9 books reflect the heart of God on these issues. I don't agree with everything that's said in these 9 books. The authors don't agree with each other on these books. Some of them call each other out in the book and say he's wrong because of, they're wrong because of. But every one of these books are gospel-driven, are coming from a gospel perspective, and have gospel solutions. You want to understand the church's complicity and the racial injustices in our country? The Color of Compromise by Tidsby is incredible. It'll sober you. You want to understand what your role in as an advocate today? His book on how to fight racism is awesome. The book, The Space Between Us, How to Find a Unity When You Disagree Vehemently with People in Your Life, incredible book, incredible helpful tool. These books are driving much of my thinking. Now, again, my own personal study of Scripture and anecdotally a number of different conversations over the years. Here's what I want to say to you. There are lots of good books out there that you can read. There are lots of books out there that have lots of beneficial things to offer you. But the most popular books on this subject are not on that screen. It's not because they have nothing to offer. It's because they are not gospel-driven, they do not have gospel hope attached to them, and you need to be careful. I'm not telling you what to read or not read. I'm not calling out books by name on this one. I'm telling you, there are anecdotal elements to these books that are helpful. I think that there's much stuff out there to be read and interacted with that can encourage you and challenge your thinking. Just telling you to be careful. I'm telling you, this is where I'm coming from. And as much as I know the other books that are out there, the most popular books on this subject, you need to be careful. Privately, I'll have whatever conversation you want. I'm just going to stop there for now. So here's my three rationale. Here's my three reasons for this series. Ready? Here's the first one. Through the lens of the gospel, the Christian faith offers us the most holistic explanations and hopeful solutions to every social ill. Any social problem that we have in our world today, the gospel of Jesus Christ allows the Christian faith to lean into it with the most holistic way of understanding it and the most hopeful way of thinking about solutions for it. The culture reduces the conversation down to it's this, it's that person, and points blame at individual things and reduces the conversation. The gospel says, no. Evil and brokenness and sin is so prevalent that there are so many different players in this, and we need to think holistically about that. While at the same time, it has the most hopeful solutions. Meaning, this isn't about fatalism where it's like, oh, well, things are just so screwed up, they'll never get better. The gospel says, no. God is in the process of bringing about a redeemed community that can change the world. And we're a part of it. We're a part of it. This is where I'm about to step on toes, and I get it. Please hear my heart on this. I am not critiquing. I'm inviting. I'm inviting you, right? I'm going to invite you. When we don't think holistically, here's some of the things that we start to say. Here's some of the ways in which we talk about this. I thought the goal was simply to be colorblind. Doesn't talking about racial differences and racial justice just create more division? That's a reductionistic view. Didn't slavery and segregation happen a long time ago? Why can't we just move on? Why should I have to pay for something that I had nothing to do with? It's not a helpful solution because it's not a holistic perspective. I'm not a racist. I don't treat people differently because of their race. I have worked hard for everything that I have. I haven't received any special privileges. So why is this even an issue that I need to talk about? Again, the gospel allows us to have a much more holistic view on these things. And again, I understand where some are coming from, and I'm stepping on toes here, just saying we've got to broaden our understanding on these issues because really at the end of the day, it's not about blame. It's about responsibility. It's not about white guilt. You'll hear that from me in just a few minutes. It's about right grief. And it's not about inverting power structures. It's not about inverting power structures. It's about inserting kingdom values. In fact, I would want to say it this way. As Christ followers, our Christian identity offers us endless hope and positions us well to engage in discussions of race, ethnicity, justice, unity with confidence, curiosity, and compassion. Say it with me. Confidence, curiosity, Compassion. Our Christian faith allows us to have this conversation where we engage it with confidence, say it with me, confidence, compassion, and curiosity. That's what our faith does for us on this thing. We possess a hope that fearlessly engages with the truth, confident that God's resurrection power is delivered into our lives as we walk in obedience to Jesus. Confidence, curiosity, and compassion. That's our posture. Second rationale for this series. When we come to truly understand God's heart for justice, we realize that grappling with matters of racial justice is not a distraction from the gospel. Rather, it flows directly from the heart of the gospel. When we start to understand God's heart for justice, it shifts our thinking from these kind of conversations are just irrelevant, they're a distraction, to no. They are flowing directly out of the heart of the gospel because it affects the heart of God. Let me give you a taste for that. Here we go. God's heart for justice. Psalm 11:7. The Lord loves righteousness and justice. Isaiah 61:18. For I, the Lord, love justice. Isaiah 30:18. For the Lord is a God of justice. Deuteronomy 32:4. His work is perfect, for all his ways are just and without any injustice. Psalm 99:4. The strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity and executed justice. Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Isaiah 1:17. Learn to do right, seek justice, and to defend the oppressed. I could spend considerable time on this singular point, and that's this. God's heart for justice throughout the scriptures is a significant theme and one that we all too quickly gloss over because our lived experience doesn't necessitate considering it. And there's danger associated with that. Tim Keller says it this way, and I so appreciate it. He says this: biblical justice differs in significant ways from all the other secular alternatives, without ignoring the concerns of any of them. Yet Christians know little about biblical justice, despite its prominence in the scriptures. This ignorance has two effects. Justice is a big deal to the heart of God. Biblical justice is a primary theme of Scripture, and yet as Christians, we have a very limited understanding of this issue, and as a result, two things are happening, and he lays it out here. He says the first one is large swaths of the church still do not see doing justice as part of their calling as individual believers. Large portions of the church, especially my generation and up, do not see a need for pursuing and advocating for justice as something that is a primary responsibility for us as believers. That's a problem, and it does not reflect the heart of God. And then he says, secondly, and this is again where I want us to get this, many younger Christians, recognizing this failure, what's the failure? Of Jesus followers in my generation and above, taking seriously this issue and responding to God's heart on it. Because we've not done this well, what's happening? Younger Christians recognizing this failure of the church and wanting to rightly rectify things, are taking up one or another of the secular approaches to justice, which introduces distortions into their practice and into their lives. Because we've done it so poorly and we've not talked about it appropriately and we've not committed ourselves to seeking God's heart on these things. The younger generation is rightly looking at us and going, y'all are messed up. You don't get this. And if we're going to do this right, we've got to go figure out other frameworks. And guess what? The only ones out there oftentimes that are being grabbed a hold of are secular, which are not gospel-centric, which do not offer gospel hope, and do not bring about real transformation. So I unapologetically say, we got to do better. Because here's my question. Here's the question that I stay up at night wrestling with. Here's my question. what is the faith of the next generation worth to me? What am I willing to give up? How hard am I willing to work? What am I willing to let go of for the sake of the next generation? Because here's the deal, if we don't do this well, the younger generation is going to walk away from what we're trying to offer because they're saying, that doesn't reflect the heart of God. And here's the problem, they're right. They're right. So we got to figure this out. Third rationale for this series. Avoiding crucial and controversial topics for the sake of unity or out of fear of being misunderstood serves as an endorsement of the status quo. If I avoid talking about tough issues, if we avoid talking about tough issues because we're afraid that that's going to create conflict, we are then saying that the status quo is okay. And here's the problem. The status quo is not okay. It doesn't reflect the heart of God. It is not consistent with God's design and desire for these things. So we got work to do. And if I stay quiet because I'm afraid of how you may react to it or that I'm going to cause disruption, notice I put unity in quotes because I think if you can't have these conversations, it doesn't reflect unity if you're trying to avoid these conversations. I think real unity is we disagree and we still love each other. That's unity. That's what we're fighting for. What I also think is fascinating about this conversation is that status quo is something that over and over again shows up, particularly in the prophetic books in the Old Testament, where God comes after Israel and Judah over and over and over again, saying to the people, you are letting the status quo drive your decisions, you're settling in and allowing the status quo, which is not okay, to continue to persist, and you are in judgment because of it. And I'm just going to point to one passage in Amos, one of the Old Testament prophets. One of the many places where we see God's heart for justice and his deep concern and his judgment for the people being brought to the forefront. In the book of Amos, there's this incredible tension that's going on in 8th century Israel. The scholars tell us that there was socioeconomic injustice, so there was a huge disparity of how people were getting access to resources and how they were responding to that, and how people were preying on other people for that. Socio-political injustices, the politics were being leveraged against one another in incredibly unjust ways. That religious injustices, where those who had certain religious positions or had entitlements in a certain direction were actually leveraging that to oppress other people. They were using God to determine or to defend their position to oppress other people. So glad we don't have that today. Incredible amount of racial, social, economic injustices were present within the culture at that time. And check out what happens in Amos 6. Verse 1, woe to you who are complacent in Zion. Woe to you who are allowing the status quo to continue. Look at what he says. You lie on beds adorned with ivory and lounge on your couches. You're just taking advantage of what you got, right? You dine on choice lambs and fattened calves. You strum away on your harps like David and improvise on medical or musical instruments. You drink wine by the bowlful and use the finest linens. You are fat and happy. You have got everything that you could ask for, and you've gotten your hands on it, and you are living life. But he's not condemning them for what they have. Then look at what he says. He says, but here's where the woe comes in. You do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph. You are not concerned about the injustices around you. He says, you've got everything you could ask for. But the woe here, the warning here is, but you don't care about the injustices around you. You're okay with the status quo. There's 3 key points we have to capture out of this. Here's the first one. What Amos is clearly identifying here is power and privilege are amoral and should not be demonized or apologized for. Here's what he's saying. We're not concerned that you have power and privilege. God is not angry with you because you have power and privilege. It's amoral, meaning it's not a good or a bad thing to have power and privilege. It's not. And you shouldn't be demonized for it, and you shouldn't have to apologize for it. You shouldn't feel guilty about it. That's the first thing he says. Then he goes on. He says, we are accountable and responsive for how we steward the power and privilege that we possess. I'm not a wrong person. I'm not a terrible individual. I shouldn't feel guilty because I have privilege and I have power. How I acquired it, that's a conversation to be had, and how I steward it is of grave concern. And then the third thing, it grieves the heart of God. Now here's the deal. I tend to try to understate things. When I say it grieves the heart of God, what I really mean here is God is angry about it. It grieves the heart of God when we leverage our power and privilege for personal advantage while remaining indifferent and unresponsive toward the injustices around us. It grieves the heart of God. God is angry, and there is a warning that is given to these individuals because they have power and privilege that they are holding on to, and they're doing it without being concerned of how they should leverage it for the injustices within their own culture. I'm a 44-year-old, white, middle-class man in America. That passage should deeply sober me. That passage should deeply concern me. Because whether I want to admit it or not, and whether you want to agree with me or not, the power, the privilege, the position that I hold, God is going to hold me accountable for how I leveraged and stewarded it. And the idea that I worked for this, I worked hard for this, I earned this, I get to do whatever I want with it. God goes, how dare you? You are blessed beyond measure. You have resources at your disposal. All you got to do is turn the news on for 5 minutes and see how COVID is wreaking havoc around our world to maybe challenge those thoughts a little bit. I have to wrestle with that. I have to take that seriously. And I cannot just throw it into a political argument and say, well, but wait a second. That doesn't reflect the heart of God. Paul the Apostle tries to carry this conversation forward. And in Galatians 6, he says this, carry each other's burdens, and in this you will fulfill the law of Christ. Those of you who have position, power, privilege, those of you who have resources, take the position that you have and carry the burdens of another. Leverage it for the benefit of another. And then he says, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Again, there's an extra L in law. I'm sorry. I cannot get rid of it. What is the law of Christ? Jesus said, here's the law of Christ. John 13, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. What's the law of Christ? Love people as I've loved you. Carry each other's burdens, and then you will fulfill the law of Christ. Those of you who have resources, have what you need, carry each other's burdens, and then love people the way I've loved you. What burdens did Jesus carry for me? All of them. How much did Jesus sacrifice so that he could have a relationship with me? How much did Jesus harness his power and privilege so that I could have anything? He gave it all up for me. And I'm supposed to model that? I'm supposed to reflect the heart of God by doing that? Man, we got to wrestle with that. It has significant implications. So again, I know I'm stepping on toes. I know that I may anger. It's not my challenge. That's not my desire. But the Spirit of God has worked me over on this one. I'm going to do the best that I can to be faithful to this. I think there are 5 things driving the cultural standoff that we're facing. There's 5 things that have brought us to this standoff that now we're trying to figure out how to navigate. First one is what I would call the hyperpoliticization of everything. Everything is hyperpoliticized right now. Ridiculously so, by the way. Politicized or polarized rhetoric. Nothing is neutral. Real and critical cultural issues used as political footballs. Legislative gridlock because of the intense polarization of the positions of the politicians. Overly reductionistic approach to seemingly everything. Only one thing can be true at a time. You can't hold this position and that position. Drawing the line between the two sides has become incredibly polarized. It's almost this, right? You're either a left-wing Marxist who is anti-cop, open borders, and anti-Christian, or you're a right-wing, angry, hateful ideologue who's too fragile to even consider your own biases. There's your dividing line. And we're going to go after each other like that? And we're going to think that somehow we should align ourselves in that? What are we doing? The early church, just hear my heart on this. The early church, first century church, here's the deal. They had a radical position where they said that God created male and female and that you should only have sex with your spouse and that marriage was designed for man and woman. They also said, our job is to pursue justice and to fight against poverty and to fight against injustice and to leverage our resources so that we can help care for hurting people and do whatever we can to fight against oppression and injustice. You tell me how in the world we reconcile those two positions on one side of the standoff or not. Got it? That's the early church. And yet, where do you sign up to have those two positions? And we're going to align ourselves with one of those two extreme views so often? Number 2, cancel culture. We got to deal with this. Anything that is said that is offensive or disagreed with is deemed to be unacceptable, and the person that said it is no longer relevant to the conversation. Identifying yourself as a victim is now considered noble. Being offended has become a virtue. Forgiveness is dismissed and disregarded. Personal growth and change doesn't matter because if you said it 25 years ago, well, that's still your position now, so we want nothing to do with you. Getting triggered is always the result of somebody else's dereliction of duty or some abusive thing that they did. If you get triggered, it's somebody else's fault. Which means this: forgiveness, bearing with one another, grace, change, reconciliation, restoration, gospel-driven virtues have no relevance in cancel culture. Number 3, I'm going to call it culture war Christianity. It's the belief that the church's primary responsibility is to openly resist and stand in strong opposition to the secular culture. Our job is to win at all costs so that the culture loses, no matter how that affects our reputation or our influence. Christians are called to leverage their political, social, financial, legislative power to legislate morality and win cultural battles. It requires us to have an aggressive and adversarial approach and the need to counterattack anyone or anything that we think is a threat. Essential to continually create enemies so that we can preach against them, demonize them, and resist them, and I can have something to say from up here. You all can say amen, and we can all go home patting ourselves on the back. It's what I grew up with. And it's all too common in our culture. Jesus wasn't in it to win it. He wasn't. He was in it to lose his life so that we could have something. And to reflect Jesus by being in it to win it. In 1 Corinthians 5, literally Paul says to the Christians, you all are criticizing the unbelievers. You're criticizing those outside of the church. And I didn't write to you telling you you should do that, because if that's what you're going to do, then you're going to have to leave the world, because you cannot do that and stay in the world. It's not your job to criticize the world. It's your job to live out the virtues of the kingdom of God. And yet here's where we are. Number 4, what I would call is the lived experiences of minorities. We have seen several egregious acts of police missteps and brutality, unnecessary abuses of power, and hate crimes against minorities. And however your political persuasion, it doesn't matter. Here's the deal. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Daunte Wright, many of these losses of life, deaths of unarmed black individuals have been filmed and widely disseminated. These incidents and videos have served to highlight the need for some sort of reform, whatever your political persuasion is. And the bottom line is, we got to grapple with that. We got to grapple with that. Here's the lived experiences piece. Several pastors reflecting on this, several gospel-driven pastors who have talked openly and vulnerably about this. Mike Edmondson, a pastor in Grand Rapids, he says this: my wife often cautions me against going out at night because she knows that when some people see me out at night, they don't see a Presbyterian pastor or a PhD in systematic theology. All they can see is a threat. Another pastor: I am tired. No, I am exhausted. As a black man in America today, I feel the multiple weights that are pressing upon every part of who I am. I'm exhausted. To be black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of protective rage. My mind is exhausted. My rage naturally turns into passionate desire or work for solutions. I want to make a difference, but my mind won't seem to work as quickly as racism and injustice does. So by the time I think I have some answers, more questions arrive because of the latest news cycle. Another pastor: we need to acknowledge that racism is real and not just fabricated. We need to take action to address it, to look at ourselves, to call it out, to call on God and help us to combat this sin of racism. Converge pastor recently said it this way: to be a black person in America is to find yourself in a perpetual state of exhaustion. And then maybe the most sobering for me was another pastor who said it this way. He said, one of the most offensive things for me as a black man in America is that when you see an unarmed black person gunned down, and your initial response is not anger, it's not grief, it's not heartbreak, it's not sadness. Your initial response is, well, we need to let the rest of the facts play out. That is incredibly offensive to me as a black man in America. The lived experiences of minorities is something we have to deal with the reality of and to not somehow gloss over it. The 5th piece of this is that we as Christians are embracing cultural, secular positions, frameworks, models, and solutions. And it's not going to produce what we think it's going to produce. The secular ideas out there there's anecdotal things that can be helpful, but they're not going to produce holistic, hope-filled solutions. They're just not. And again, I don't want to bog down here, but I'm just going to give you two of the secular things that are kind of primary. And I'm not going to call out the names. I'm not going to demonize people unnecessarily, but two of the kind of the driving narratives of this is this, the first one. The majority group within a population will never work toward the good of a minority group unless it serves their own best interest. One of the primary elements of the model that's out there, the most popular books, the secular models that are out there, here's one of their primary tenets, is that a majority group will never work for the best interest of a minority group unless it serves their own best interest. Now, here's the deal. In some ways, apart from Christ, there's probably some truth to that. In fact, I would say there's a lot of truth to that. Because what's the motivation if it's not going to serve my best interest? But that is unbelievably anti-gospel. Because the gospel of Jesus Christ calls me, compels me, tells me that it is my job to give over, to surrender, to offer whatever I can for the betterment of, for the advocacy of someone in a different state of place in life than I am. And I do it not for my own self-interest, but for the glory of God. The second one, truth is believed to be exclusively socially constructed. That the only truth that we can claim, the only thing that we can really hold on to, is that if we get together and we hear people's stories, then we can understand what's really true. Now let me qualify that. I've said to you before, and I'll say it many, many times over. I think one of the best things that we can do right now in our culture is stop talking and start listening. I think we need to listen. I think we need to learn. I think we need to lament. And I think part of my job right now is to listen, to learn, and lament, which is why this whole thing feels even a little bit difficult for me, because am I even ready to start talking yet? But I'm going to try. I feel like I have a responsibility to. And so there is something to be said for I don't understand the lived experience of someone that is not like me unless I'm willing to listen, learn, and lament with them. But we cannot endorse a position that says the only truth that's available to us is if we all get together and tell each other our stories. Because God says, no, I declare what's true. I declare what's right. And when I do it, I offer you solutions that don't keep you in the quagmire. And don't just reset power structures, but actually bring about kingdom values and the redeemed community that we're fighting for. I love this perspective. One of the books I showed you is a book called Beyond Racial Gridlock, George Yancey. I'm almost done here. He says it this way: the way we define a social problem will affect the way we conceive of its solution. If we have an incomplete definition of a problem, then we will envision a limited solution. If the real problem is larger than our restricted definition, then our solution will be insufficient. You saw this on Facebook come across yesterday. Reductionistic explanations lead to myopic solutions. When we decide that we're going to so lock in on, well, this is the thing that's wrong, this is the problem with our culture, this is the problem with this issue, then whatever solutions you come up with are going to be just as myopic, just as limited, which means they're not going to fix it. A teacher has a kid who's failing in the classroom, and if the reductionistic perspective is, well, he's just not eating enough. He doesn't bring a lunch with him to school, so let's just make sure he gets fed. And you start feeding him. But that doesn't change anything. It's not less than the food, but it's probably a lot more than the food. There might be much bigger systemic issues that we got to wrestle with. And yet what's happening in our culture is we're reducing the conversation down to this or that person or that political party, rather than saying, no. Reductionistic explanations lead to myopic solutions, which by definition are not solutions at all. Next week, I'm going to encourage you this week, I'm inviting you this week to read Ephesians chapter 1, verses 18 through Ephesians chapter 2:22. Ephesians 1:18 through 2:22. Ephesians 1:19 through 22 is one thought by Paul, one singular major thought and theme by Paul that I want to dig into next week. But I want to give you a taste for that, because this is what Paul says. There's something so much bigger about the cross than I think what we realize. Paul says this: for he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one. We'll talk more about that next week. And has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside its flesh, the law with its commands and regulations. Again, there's a lot here. I'll get to it next week. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put death to death their hostility. That he has brought them together, and in the face of corruption and demonic entities, Christ defeated death and everything that separates us. We'll celebrate more of that next week. So here's what I'm going to close, and then we're going to sing together. I want you to think about conversations, because here's the deal. Say it with me: confidence, compassion, curiosity. Compassion, confidence, curiosity. This is the posture I want for you. As Christ followers, this is where we should be. I think it's about having healthy, holistic conversations. So what I want to do is, in the email that went out, and when this video is posted online, you'll see these questions as part of the discussion guide. Here's some of the questions that I think can help us have these conversations. Can you help me understand why this topic is so important to you? In what ways have you or someone close to you experienced bias, racism, oppression, or ostracization due to your race or culture? Do you experience me to be curious and empathetic when it comes to issues like race and justice? What do you wish I better understood about how your lived experience is different than mine? the way that we begin to engage this in that third way is that we, with confidence and compassion and curiosity, are willing to have conversations both with the younger generations and with those that are most different from us and have many lived experiences different than us. We got to do it. We got to have a heartbreak for it. We've got to recognize that the cost is too high. Because I'll be honest with you, you'd be hard pressed to figure out what I'm willing to surrender, what I'm not willing to give up for the faith of the next generation. And so unapologetically, I will stand here and say, whatever we got to do, that we got to give up, that does not include the gospel of Jesus, anything else I will be willing to throw away if it means we can help the next generation see and understand who this Jesus is and what he wants for us in this world. Would you stand together, please?